Oh, thank you, Lucy. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome from us in Sheffield. It's really rainy and grey day, so it's nice we have this seminar to cheer us up a little bit and have a exciting discussion about, who has a right to citizenship, how to cross this sort of a border, which is more symbolic, but uh, could be bought by money. With money. I'm Aneta Piekut, and together with my colleagues from Migration Research Group at the University of Sheffield, Lucy Mablin and Lucy Potter, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this online seminar. Today we have two guests, and the first is Dan Hamlet from University of Sheffield, and the second one is Sarah Peck from Northumbria University. And the topic of today's seminar is citizenship and the everyday geography of economic citizenship. Dan is a senior lecturer in human geography, University of Sheffield, and also senior research fellow at the University of Johannesburg. His research explores geographies of citizenship in everyday life, with particular focus on everyday encounters with different techniques of governmentality and narrations of nationhood. Sarah, who is a research fellow in the Department of Geography at the Northumbria University, also in her work explores civic space, migration, global development through collaborative research methods. Her main areas of research are everyday activism, solidarity, and civic space, but also critical geographies of migration, development, race, and belonging, and also philosophy and culture of aid and development. So we're really happy both Dan and Sarah agreed to speak during this seminar today. Just before I hand over the microphone to our guest speakers today, just a few words about the etiquette. Some of you might be new to this platform, which we use for seminars, Blackboard Collaborate. So if you would like to raise a question, there will be time at the very end after the presentations, and you can use, there is an icon below the slide now with a hand up. Or if you prefer, you can leave your question in a chat, which is on the right side in a panel. We would like also to record, but we'll just record the presentations part of the seminar. So don't worry if you feel like your questions are sensitive or you're not sure how to phrase them. This will not be recorded and will not publish it anywhere. So I will chair the session today, and my colleagues will also participate in asking the questions, but obviously all of you are welcome to ask questions. Okay, so this is so far all from me. Let me just change the slide so Dan and Sarah can take over and start their talk. Okay, so the microphone is yours, Dan and Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Aneta and Lucy for the invitation. We've already had wonderful introductions, so I won't dwell on those. But there is one other person in the room that I need to acknowledge, and that's Owen Parker, who, along with Sarah and I, we are working on developing a large-scale project on this topic. So it's hopefully going to be the first step on a long journey of looking at this topic in detail. And what follows is the presentation is a paper that Sarah and I have developed over a few years, which tries to set out the kind of this conceptual and theoretical agenda for a project that we've been discussing for, I'm estimating, about 5 or 6 years now. It's been long in the gestation, but we are getting there. So the title is Our Citizenship is Being Prostituted, the Everyday Geographies of Economic Citizenship Regimes. You'll understand the start of that quote later on. It comes from a quote from an activist in the Caribbean about the impacts of citizenship by investment schemes in their sense in terms of everyday life. So you may be thinking, well, why does this matter in general terms? Well, if you've been following the news, I mean, we now have a quote here about on Twitter from the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, This is taken from the Commons record a few days ago. And Owen, thank you very much for forwarding me this Twitter exchange on this. So Sir Bradman was in the House of Commons and said, when it comes to golden visas, I'm very proud of the action the government took in relation to Russian individuals following the invasion, when we stopped the sale of golden visas to particular individuals. At which point the Labour politician Chris Bryant challenged this as to, are you selling citizenship? It's kind of shocking that you're selling citizenship. And so I said, no, it's issuance, not selling. But this, I think, points to the crux or the starting point for our work on this topic, which is that forms of economic citizenship, golden visas and other visas, have been they've been around for many years in different guises and different forms, but have increasingly come to the forefront of political discussion and popular consciousness in recent months and years, whether this in relation to the imposition of sanctions on Russian oligarchs and others arising from the invasion of Ukraine, or going back a few years previously to the assassination of the Maltese investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who at the time was working on investigating political corruption in Malta, including in relation to the citizenship by investment schemes operating in Malta. That case has been back in the news in the last few weeks because two brothers who were accused of murder of that case have pled guilty, but there is a much bigger iceberg behind that in terms of other parties involved. Anyway, that's the kind of broad picture of the, perhaps to give you a popular culture hook into things. But what do we mean by economic citizenship? Well, economic citizenship has been around for a long time. You see it in the UK, in the USA, in Portugal, in Italy and beyond. And there's really been a growing interest and expansion of these schemes since the 2008 financial crisis. There were much earlier versions of these schemes amongst the Pacific Islands and elsewhere, used to attract investment and talent and so on around the world. But in simple terms, what these programs do, economic citizenship programs do, is they attract high worth individuals who, in return for financial investment, benefit from a range of things. But most commonly preferential tax arrangements, rights to residence, enhanced global mobility, often all these provided without the same obligations demanded of ordinary citizens. So we'll explore this in a bit more detail, and specifically in relation to citizenship by investment schemes, which are a particular branch of economic citizenship processes. In broad terms, what's really interesting and problematic often about economic citizenship schemes is we see this happening alongside a return to nativist politics and an exclusionary approach to citizenship in many countries around the world, the UK included. At the same time, almost a denationalising of citizenship, the kind of rise of the European Union and other supranational bodies and the kind of citizenship ideas that go with those. But juxtaposed with increasingly exclusionary citizenship regimes we see in many states, we see this instrumentalization or this marketization of citizenship as an entity to be commodified and sold, which kind of worked in opposition to those ideas of nativist politics and an exclusionary narration of citizenship. What many have argued is that these schemes, these economic citizenship schemes, have been a strategic response to the process of globalization, both of the individual and their mobile capital, but also as a manifestation of the intrusion of the market into the political sphere. And understandably, this has led to very critical conversations around not only whether citizenship is something that can or should be monetized, but also to the very understandings of what citizenship is, the meanings, the emotions, and so on, the different forms of citizenship that we're going to talk about through the rest of the presentation. There's a lot of historical precedent in terms of labour migration in Germany, in Southern Africa and beyond that we explore further in the paper this is drawn from. And if you want to read that, I think Annetta and Lucy circulated the paper earlier. It was published in Progress in Human Geography very recently. But let's kind of focus in upon, I'm aware of time, so I'm focusing upon the specific focus of today's talk. And this is the role of say, citizenship by investment schemes as part of a variegated landscape of preferential citizenship policies. As I say, interest in these has grown since 2008, but has also, thank you for posting the link, Lucy, been kind of stimulated or accelerated as well by the COVID-19 pandemic, as wealthy individuals have sought security in times of global unpredictability, seeking ways to kind of access healthcare, education resources, and secure forms of global mobility for economic reasons as well. Meanwhile, a range of vulnerable, well, not just vulnerable, many vulnerable nation states look for pathways towards greater economic resilience. So many of the states who offer citizenship by investment schemes are often small island states with quite limited economies and vulnerable to global climate change and the impacts of that. So they're seeking these kind of things. So what we're basically seeing is programs being used to try and attract high worth individuals who, in return for financial investment, governments will use to pay for development schemes, job diversification, and so on and so forth. The individuals then benefit from preferential tax arrangements and so on and so forth. As already mentioned, there's a long kind of history of this. We saw this perhaps not most infamously, but very famously with David Lay's work on Canada's expansion of its business immigration program in the 1980s and 1990s as part of a national population policy effort to address declining population growth rates and to attract particularly East Asian investors to stimulate national economic growth. And the rise of that kind of transnational class of hypermobile investors led to certain impacts locally. There was the rise of the so-called monster houses in Vancouver, and lots of controversies remain around the presence and role of these transnational investors. We see similar schemes and similar outcomes in other parts of the world, and there's a lot of work being done on the experiences of the kind of ultra-high wealthy, ultra-high net worth individuals, and people like Roland Atkinson in USP at Sheffield has been as part of that kind of work on that. We're also seeing this kind of the rise of these schemes as linked often to the rise of the growing presence of the private sector who promote the schemes, who help governments design them and then act as intermediaries for investors seeking forms of citizenship. And this is often targeted at the rise or kind of increasing numbers of ultra wealthy citizens in countries that have been traditionally considered outside of the global core, and kind of then the kind of geopolitical benefits of that and so on. We can pick up some questions on those if you want some more specifics later on, but what we're really seeing is that the simultaneous growth in numbers of super rich and ultra high net worth individuals has intersected with the increasing drive by states and governments to diversify economic streams, income streams, to promote national development. What's really interesting, they're both kind of obviously proponents and critics of these schemes. And what proponents like Henley and Partners or Art and Capital argue is that these schemes offer remarkably successful sovereign financing and economic innovation platforms, raising hundreds of millions of dollars, euros, pounds, you name the currency, in debt-free capital to provide funding for healthcare, social and cultural investments, and so on. The kind of proponents argue they provide a safety net against the volatility, economic volatility that countries around the world are having to manage, particularly those with smaller and tourism or global trade reliant economies. Understandably, there is a counter argument to this, which is that these schemes are often very controversial. So what you can see on screen here is a scoring system if you want to acquire citizenship by investment in Malta. This is a really interesting and controversial example of a citizenship by investment scheme. So the scheme in Malta was introduced in 2013. The then President of Malta slipped in while Parliament was in recess, so it lacked a great deal of political scrutiny. And basically what you have to do, if you're an investor seeking Maltese citizenship through investment, you have to pay 650,000 euros into a development fund, plus then 25,000 euros for any dependents or spouses who you also want to have citizenship. Upon launch, there were no conditions for any prior links, investment or residence in Malta. However, in the face of controversies about buying EU citizenship, obviously if you're buying citizenship of a country within the European Union, you de facto got EU-level citizenship, and a nod to Owen here, who has written about this previously. The Maltese programme adjusted to introduce a new clause called the effective resident status, and that was essentially that you had to reside in Malta for 12 months before applying for citizenship through investment. That's the legislative word. In reality, the citizenship by investment industry and brokers encourage clients to apply based upon a few days of residency. And research has shown the mean average number of days for applicants applying for citizenship or successful applicants for citizenship by investment was 16 days. And this was exploited by using a loophole of quote unquote genuine links. And genuine links include some of the items listed on the screen in front of you. Minor engagements with Maltese society, including joining a local club or society, subscribing to a local newspaper, subscribing to a phone provider, or making donations to charitable causes. And what you would get through this is a set of points for each of these quote-unquote genuine links that you could demonstrate. And as long as you reached a passing score of 220, you were able to acquire that status. So for each day spent in Malta, you would accrue 15 points. If you rented a flat, that would give you 60 points, whereas opening a bank account or subsidising or kind of making payments to a local society would get you 10 points each. So you can see you didn't have, despite this clause of effective resident status, you could never set foot in Malta, but still, through these mechanisms, acquire citizenship by investment. This has led to controversies in terms of the access to European level rights and citizenship, which Owen has written about previously, but also the implications and impacts of these schemes on local society. When we talk about Malta, we can identify not only the kind of political corruption that's been argued around, but also profound impacts upon local housing markets and housing stock and other impacts on a local scale. Ultimately, in a broader, what we want to return to then from this is to recognise that the attraction or appeal of buying citizenship from somewhere like Malta links to this idea of a hierarchy of citizenship. And if you go onto the websites of either Art and Capital or Henley and Partners, you can see they offer these rankings of global passport rankings. As an aside, it was a wonderful activity to do with most level 3 students yesterday to get them to try and rank the passports of the world. And it was really interesting how those conversations evolved. In how they are done in practice is through the kind of valuing of mobility and life quality in different countries. And as a result of that, you see the marketisation of citizenship by investment by certain countries, often with limited economies or limited economic diversity, to try and appeal to investors who were seeking greater mobility to pursue either investment in entrepreneurial activities or to provide access to health, education and other services for their family, or as a possible exit strategy from situations of political instability. So what we kind of see here is that citizenship is an arena in which wealth can be both an enabler of and barrier to citizenship, that the wealthy are able to acquire quote unquote stronger citizenships and continue that kind of wealth creation and wealth accretion, whereas the poor are denied these opportunities to migrate in the same way. And this further entrenches global inequalities and disconnects citizenship from the social aspects we normally see as intertwined with citizenship. I think at this point I'm passing over to Sarah, I believe.
Thanks, Dan. Let's go back a slide. Thanks, Dan. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about sort of specific citizenship by investment schemes. So on this slide, as Dan was saying, you can see this kind of idea of hierarchies of citizenship, leading citizenship by investment programs, and the table on the left-hand side of the slide is taken from OECD website and provides some kind of rating around citizenship by investment and schemes that are considered high risk by the OECD. And as you can also see, as Dan was saying, that there's kind of very particular geographies to these schemes. So they're very focused, often very focused on small island developing states, and it's been commented that the Caribbean and the Mediterranean are now becoming kind of key hubs for such programs, because they're really key to kind of economic development strategies for revenue generation and can often account for a considerable proportion of GDP, which can be used in response posed by natural hazards and the opportunities for limited economic diversification. So this kind of comparison continues, as you see on this next slide. So this is taken from a website called Global Citizen Solutions, and they describe themselves as a boutique investment migration consultancy firm focused on finding the right residency or citizenship by investment program for individuals wishing to secure their future and become global citizens. And I think the way that they kind of talk about global citizens is really interesting in this context. And as you can see, they've got, they're comparing the programs that you could potentially purchase around the investment that you might have to make, the types of investment available, how long you have to, the residency requirements, the time that you'll get your citizenship, and the ease of the process. So again, comparing how complicated the process is in different jurisdictions. And if we go into a bit more detail, looking at these comparisons, so you'll see on the top, discussion of the citizenship by investment scheme in Dominica. So the main applicant must donate $100,000 to the Economic Diversification Fund. You can add extra, you can buy citizenship for your dependents at an extra cost as well. And they also have to go through the procedure of finding a government approved approved agent to help them with their application. So there aren't any residency requirements in Dominica. the investor will get the benefit of visa-free travel to the UK, the Schengen area and Hong Kong, and hopefully get their citizenship in around 4 months. Comparing that to Malta, so the example that Dan was just chatting through, Malta's I think a slightly kind of more complex situation, and the scheme has undergone some recent changes. So the current scheme offers routes to obtaining Maltese citizenship by naturalisation in as little as kind of 12 to 36 months, depending on how much the investor is required to invest. So there is a direct investment of a minimum of 690,000 euros. But there's also, and I think this part for me was really interesting, also there's some requirements around property and investment in property, but also a philanthropic donation of 10,000 euros, which goes to non-governmental organisations, non-profit organisations, and those organisations have to be registered in a particular way for them to be eligible for that donation. But yeah, I think that sort of side of it is absolutely fascinating to me, and how those kind of donations may be shaping kind of civil society there. So just to think a little bit about how this rise of kind of CBI schemes has influenced how we think about citizenship. So I guess the critics of these kind of schemes have said that they feel that it's moving away from citizenship as this kind of emblem of national identity and territorial rootedness to a sort of thin citizenship where there is reduced importance around collective identity, shared beliefs, obligations, risks. And Baubach talks about this idea of citizenship light, a citizenship that is no longer intertwined with rights and duties, identity, or the need for political engagement. So critics would argue that the investor doesn't have an interest in the long-term health of the state or the body politic. They're not dependent upon the state for social services, for care in their old age, or the provision of education for their children. The investor remains footloose, benefiting from the enhanced mobility afforded by their new passport and enjoying the economic benefits of perhaps preferential tax arrangements, but without that kind of long-term connection to or dependence upon the state. So the critics would say that these arrangements lead to an inauthentic citizenship, are hollowing out both the concept and the civic aspects of citizenship. So I think underpinning these concerns are kind of questions that talk about the meanings, the conceptualizations and experiences of citizenship, and ultimately, I suppose, questions about the extent to which selling passports and citizenship stretches the moral fabric of society and alters the sort of social dynamics and feelings of belonging. And this slide just shows some of the investors who have been granted Maltese citizenship via the citizenship by investment route. So I'll hand back over to Dan to talk a bit more about the everyday geographies of citizenship.
Great, thanks. So just to the other message in terms of the individuals on the slides here is all these individuals have gone through a quote unquote due diligence process to try and weed out or prevent issues around money laundering or tax evasion and so on. But as you can see from the investigative journalism that's gone in behind this slide, that's not always a very effective process. And that's one of the big critiques by activists and civil society movements is around the failures of that due diligence process. And certainly, as we'll return to later on, we come back to some vignettes from the Caribbean, the potential negative impacts of those concerns around the security of these processes, leading to changes in the passport power and effectiveness of the passports from countries who provide citizenship by investment schemes. So I'll give you a little bit of a trailer for something that will follow later. In the meantime, we want to focus upon a gap that we see as existing in the literature. Previous literature looking at economic citizenship schemes and specifically citizenship by investment schemes has generally focused upon trying to access investors or abstract theoretical discussion in relation to the meanings of citizenship. What we already are, and so as part of that, people have argued that citizenship by investment schemes are quote unquote invisible to existing citizenry, that the presence of these investors is so peripheral and marginal that they're not there in everyday life, they're not present, their impacts are not felt. Our contention is rather different, that actually we can see the visibility of citizenship by investment schemes in multiple ways. On the slide there, you can see some photos of the property and the fencing underneath it. These are the monster houses in Vancouver and some local protests against those. And the other photos there from the Leverhulme wetlands, and a kind of consultation going on around the building of a luxury tourist resort in the middle of a national kind of protected environment, and lots of debates around that. So what we're trying to get to here is looking at how, or addressing the importance of exploring the quotidian or the everyday, informal and mundane understandings of the everyday lived nature of citizenship, and how the economic citizenship schemes have these everyday impacts on local communities, environments and economies, or in other words, on how they shape ordinary citizens' engagements with the notions and feelings of citizenship and belonging. And certainly the lack of kind of popular and political discussion until very recently of CBI schemes, of citizenship by investment schemes in Western Europe, perhaps chimes with Jopka's argument that the schemes and their beneficiaries are practically invisible to existing citizenry. But rather, I think we side more with David Lay's work around the presence of investor and business immigrants as being vividly apparent in both the kind of built landscape, but also we would argue in terms of the kind of social and cultural landscape. And the outcomes of these schemes are having profound impacts on the everyday lives of ordinary citizens. And these are perhaps most magnified in small island states in particular. But again, we could turn to someone like Roland Atkinson's work and others and look at how investors, as part of schemes in the UK, are disrupting and distorting parts of the London housing market, and others other work also on rural and urban areas elsewhere in the UK and beyond. What we argue is that citizenship by investment schemes are no longer invisible, but have these profound impacts in Malta, on housing markets, on access to public property and public space, in various Caribbean islands, again, the enclosure of public spaces of previously public areas, the destruction of wetland habitats and other natural environments, all in return for promises of things like employment creation and so on. But as critics will argue, Sarah will point to these in some detail in a moment, what kinds of jobs are being created and so on, and what are the longer term costs of these. So what we're really calling for in this work is the need for a much deeper, nuanced understanding of how such schemes affect everyday life and the application that they have in terms of theories of citizen and everyday citizenship. Underpinning this, we kind of draw quite heavily upon the work of Osler and Starkey, who are scholars in the education field, and talk about citizenship as being about status, feeling, and practice. Status often seems to be this kind of reciprocal relation between the citizen and the state, and the citizen is expected to kind of complete certain actions and activities of citizenship, paying taxes, contributing to the economy, undertaking jury service, essentially voting and so on, in return for which they're guaranteed security, justice, education, and other services. But it's important that this idea of the status of citizenship is not static, it's an ongoing site of struggle and contestation. And our concern here is that economic citizenship schemes and CBI schemes can unsettle and reshape those relationships by the introduction of new forms and legalities of citizenship, with the potential to strip individuals of the kind of reciprocal feeling of citizenship and belonging to a state, which may then lead to new forms or contestations of the practices of citizenship. And here we talk about citizenship as practice, we talk about the kind of repetitions that are part and parcel of relationships that are kind of inherent to our relationship with the state as citizens. And whether when someone starts to feel their status is perhaps in question or being jeopardized, in particular kind of perhaps devalued by economic citizenship schemes, what are the implications of that in terms of people's willingness to practice citizenship in particular ways? What are the potential realities here in terms of dissent, activism, and so on? So in other words, this idea going back to the idea of citizenship as a site of struggle. And then in terms of citizenship as feeling, again, returns here to the emotional connection that individuals hold with the state or the imagined community to which they are of which they are a citizen. And again, how may the local or existing or ordinary citizens feel if that emotional connection is being jeopardized or disrupted or compromised by the granting of citizenship to those who have no physical presence in the local area or no kind of historical connection to the country. So those we're asking, how do these citizenship schemes produce new non-traditional sites of struggle over citizenship? What are the new forms of contestation that are emerging both over the real estate and kind of physical landscape impacts of investments through these schemes, but also impacts upon employment, public spaces, natural landscapes, housing markets, and so on. So what we're trying to do here is think through how economic citizenship schemes produce differing subject positions and identities within the body politic, and how these are continually and perhaps even more kind of intensified in the idea of being a site of struggle and contestation to everyday life. And And one of the kind of key concerns we've picked up already through some preliminary work and anecdotal research is the risk of these citizenship by investment schemes, the risk of them exacerbating exclusionary views of who belongs, and this becoming quite a vociferous and very powerful and emotive viewpoint, and the implications that has in terms of the future of a sense of belonging, a sense of citizenship. So at this point, we're going to finish the talk with a series of vignettes from civil society activists in the Caribbean, and for these I'm going to turn to Sarah to introduce them.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, yeah, so like Dan said, I'm just going to finish with three short commentaries from civil society activists talking about the Grenadian Citizenship by Investment Programme. And I guess we feel that these vignettes start to kind of articulate some of these everyday concerns that we're interested in. So just to give a little bit of context, Grenada is a tri-island archipelago in the Eastern Caribbean with a population of around 110,000 people. It redeveloped its Citizenship by Investment Programme in 2013. The programme is highly rated among similar schemes for its relative affordability and simple application process. Investors pay into either the National Transformation Fund or into an approved real estate project in return for securing Grenadian citizenship and passport. In 2018, the government of Grenada issued 851 passports to CBI investors in return for investments totaling 147 million Eastern Caribbean dollars, which is about 54 million US dollars. So this first vignette is from an article in the Now Grenada newspaper by civil society activist Sandra Ferguson. And Sandra says, "The economic citizenship programme has brought our country and the region into disrepute, given the disproportionate number of crooks and con men that the programme has attracted, and made travel more difficult and expensive for the ordinary citizen. For example, the imposition of visa requirements to Canada, now required of citizens of Grenada and Antigua and Barbuda, and the warnings received from other countries to which we have travelled hassle-free. What does our citizenship and passport mean to each of us citizens whose label Stringberry here? Will we allow our government and its marketing agents to continue to desecrate our citizenship and passport? Stand up for Grenada. Grenada deserves better." So here Sandra highlights the impact of economic citizenship schemes on ordinary citizens. So she talks about the changing mobility value of the Grenadian passport, but also the potential damage done to the values, perceptions and meanings associated with the passport itself. The tarnishing of the passport by association with the CBI scheme, as Sandra talks about, has potentially very real effects for ordinary Grenadian citizens who find their ability to travel overseas, including for work, either restricted or increasingly bureaucratic and costly. Our second vignette is from Valerie Thompson, writing in the New Today newspaper. "Grenadians, we must follow what is happening with the CBI programme. Has anyone realised that Grenada is being prostituted on the international market? Grenada is being sold out, and we are going cheap, cheap, cheap. Our citizenship is being prostituted, and if any of these new citizens come here, we are then raped of our patronry. We are being screwed, especially by those whom we hire, and they have failed miserably. We must restore the tarnished reputation of our country. What used to be our pride and joy, Grenada, Isle of Spice, is now a pure pimp's paradise." So here Valerie uses really powerful language to talk about Grenadian citizenship being prostituted, raped, tarnished. And she mobilises her argument. She kind of invokes the differing origins of citizenship as status between hereditary citizenship and that of sort of monetary citizenship through the Citizenship by Investment Programme. So for crucially then, I think the CBI schemes themselves are reshaping meanings of citizenship. Not only are the CBI schemes themselves reshaping meanings of citizenship, but also the responses to such schemes. And our final vignette today comes from civil society group Friends of the Earth Grenada. And writing in the Now Grenada newspaper, they discuss a proposed CBI project at the site of the Leverhulme wetlands, which are a fragile and protected environmental site of international importance in the St Patrick district in northern Grenada, which campaigners warn is at risk of significant damage from a proposed CBI-funded hotel development. And Friends of the Earth Grenada say, "In defence of the proposed project, Minister Moses hinted at the creation of 1,000 jobs in the local communities to service rooms and to keep guests happy. which would avoid the long journeys into St George for work and the culminating economic drain for those employees. Of course, employment is always a major issue in rural communities in Grenada. But are we sure that those communities are willing to sacrifice this valuable ecosystem for the possibility of low-paid work, which might ultimately not be forthcoming if the demise of the previous proposed developments is anything to go by? So here Friends of the Earth Grenada are articulating their concerns relating to the enclosure of previously public natural landscapes by private developers in return for the promise of future employment opportunities. They also suggest that there is an uncertainty associated with such promises, and referring to the demise of the previous proposed developments, that the destruction of such natural landscapes related to CBI schemes does not necessarily guarantee the anticipated and promised outcomes. This hints at diverging priorities between citizens and the state, and a growing sense of exclusion, in this instance from natural landscapes, elsewhere linked to affordable housing and others. These feelings of exclusion and disenfranchisement threaten an erosion of the reciprocal relations of citizenship between state and citizens. And ordinary citizens may increasingly question and/or reject the behaviours, practices and dispositions of good citizens by withdrawing from expected actions of citizenship, mobilising to reclaim rights or engaging in more hidden everyday moments of resistance and dissent. So we just wanted to finish today thinking about what sort of questions are opened up by thinking about citizenship by investment through this kind of everyday lens. And it seems that we need a bit more clarity around the multiple driving forces behind citizenship programmes and how these programmes are connected to wider development policy and planning. And a critical exploration of the impacts of citizenship regimes on local economic, social, political, cultural and environmental conditions and the lives of ordinary citizens. For example, how do CBI schemes reshape the mobility of existing citizens, their employment opportunities and practices and their access to previously public spaces and landscapes? Questions are also raised as to how and to what extent economic citizenship regimes reshape relations between differentiated citizens within the body politic, and how these relations influence individuals and the body politic more widely. It's also vital to understand how ordinary citizens encounter these schemes and the ways in which these experiences do or maybe don't change their feelings, practices and habitus of citizenship. And allied to this, work is needed to address how economic citizenship schemes and their impacts are being evaluated, resisted and subverted by local populations. And I just wanted to finish with a really recent quote from the Now Grenada newspaper, which I found when I was doing a bit of preparation for this talk, that I think really captures hopefully captures what we were trying to talk about. So it's by a guy called Brian S. Samuel, commenting on the Grenadian CBI programme. And he says, CBI has the capacity to critically affect every single Grenadian, even more than it already has. It affects the ability of every Grenadian to travel unhindered by onerous visa requirements and suspicions because of our nationality. The ability of young Grenadians to buy reasonably priced middle-class housing without being priced out by cash-rich CBI investors. The ability of Grenadians ultimately to run our own affairs and to maintain our own sovereignty. The same sovereignty that our ancestors fought and died to achieve for us. And he finishes, and we're going to turn around and sell that. So we'll finish there. Thank you very much.